Let's look at who is allowed in society, and that's the trolley problem in law for us. Okay, every law ever enforced was derived directly out of the trolley problem. Laws are the agency with which we change the course of natural events by imposing a societal force into the environment, which impact human needs directly, both by restricting some and aiding others. Laws rely on the constant feedback from the trolley problem. If an interaction shows a certain amount of consistent accidents, a traffic sign will likely be put up there. Okay? Trolley problem happens on each and every level of rule and law decision making. It can be as small as someone setting a rule about how they organize their work desk at home and having no one touch them, to setting cross-societal standards such as traffic laws. Okay? So it can be small and it can be society widespread. In this essence, the trolley problem is a minority versus majority game, meant to aid and act as our explanations and ethical justifications for laws we create and follow. It is the statistical endeavor, simply because the trolley problem itself uses statistics to make ethical conclusions. So if we can save 5 lives, we can, or save 5,000 lives, we can risk 1. Right? That's our societal ethical game that we use in order to justify our laws. For example, even though acts of not wearing seatbelts have occasions where they happen to save the driver's well-being in an accident, statistically the casualties and injuries overall are way less prevalent when the seatbelt is worn, which is easily objectively and statistically provable. Additionally, factor that the classic trolley problem doesn't involve is the subjective. Okay? Usually it's like, well, you know, if you're going to change the lever, there's 1 versus 5 people. There's you, the act of you pushing somebody, but there's much more to that in the real world. The voices of people reporting directly on their subjective experiences being used as empirical evidence. For example, when someone raises and develops love for a child, it easily becomes their number 1 choice against any numbers of suffering individuals in other camps or in the other parts of the world. Parents of an individual will likely aim to vote for their child, even if the person is statistically in the moral judgment minority, or if it is someone's best friend, what if of same creed, what if same skin color or sex, what if of same blood, right? Laws are like yes-no binary variables, which is what the trolley problem has. Laws don't like complexity. Yes or no is the best. Okay, walk or stop. Right? Walk or go. Of course, usually there are more than 2 and up to multiple variables. The trolley problem plays out very differently in the real world, with numerous variables compared to simplistic hypothetical scripts. The more diversity of expression in the system, the more variables for trolley problems as contributing factors to their ever-growing complexity. Okay? In high stakes and high contention zones, we implement the trolley solution more diligently. The higher the stakes, the stronger the laws. The big intersections have lights, smaller side roads might have signs or common sense rules. Not even a sign, people just know how to behave when they come to create the society, but through interaction. Laws are bendable and conditional with a sliding boundary, which is point of this entire topic. This is what I'm constantly drawing attention to. This means that ethics are not universal, but can and do vary in societies by design and by default. We create the laws, so they are conditional and they are not universal. They really do change. Now let's continue with what I like to call the minorities of the trolley problem. Whenever a piece of law is enacted, it will invariably create minority groups. Basically, out of the bell curve of something that becomes, if you will, a trolley problem bulk of the curve, there's always going to be people who drew the short straw, just as the trolley problem itself suggests. There are 2 groups or kinds of minorities, ones that get elevated and the ones that get outcast. So basically there's going to be the elevated group here and the outcast group on this end, okay? This includes the genetic cards dealt just as much as the randomized circumstances post-conception and birth, meaning that somebody can be born with traits that will help them in the societies that they're to live in, as well as some people are born into cultural circumstances that will help them do better in life. There are always minorities. It is an inevitable part of our evolution. The outcast minorities are the casualties of the trolley problem, the ones that circumstantially drew the shortest straw. Okay? Enacting laws that attend to the majority becomes a societal problem for a minority of individuals whose human-born needs happen to not to align with the majority's mean expression of those same needs. So basically, the society is saying, okay, most people need this need satisfied, And there's always going to be a small group of minorities whose need is not expressed on that level. But because legislation is passed to support those needs of majorities, that's gonna that strategy is going to find itself badly with different needs, let's say, of minorities. For the privilege of the society, it becomes a fast track. So as much as the people who are outcast in the way where they can't keep up, the people who are born and they have a step forward with the whole thing, it'll be easier for them. They'll be enabled to go places much more. Biological experience is on the side of the bell curve, just like biological non-expertise. Okay? We can have a handful of people unable to perform a job, deeming them incompetent, and a handful of people that will do better than anyone else, deeming them experts. Rewarding contributing minorities versus neglecting non-contributing minorities. Okay? And in between is the people who are just normal, as statistically one would say. And normal, ironically, even in a generic sense, actually matches with that definition perfectly. There's usually one prevailing norm. If the society decides to open to minorities in their different phenotypical expressions legally, it will also need to choose which minority group is the most important one, considering that abundance of options goes extremely exponential. So basically, once you start accepting diversity, any diversity of any sort goes. This is why tolerance usually proves to be the best rule of thumb, directive for inclusion and acceptance of immeasurable numbers of expressions, and true tolerance tolerates it all, meaning that rather than choosing specific groups to be tolerant of, we just make a rule to be tolerant of any differences to some degree, right? Expansive liberty is also a society's vulnerable spot. So the more libertyful a society becomes, as strong societies in the societal context, not individual context, are strong when order is strong and tight, like tightened laces of a shoe, right? So the more a flower opens to the world, the more vulnerable it is to the world, but it can also disseminate more. There's a lot of pros and cons in the game of libertyful expression and ordered expression, which is the clamping down. Examples: sizes of societal infrastructures based on standardized height across the entire population, tall, small, right? As a result, tall and short minorities draw the short straw. In this bell curve, this would be the amount of people that will be in the mean height out of a population. And then you have people who are too tall and people who are too short, both of which won't be able to adapt to society being built for the norm, which is how the trolley problem gets solved in this context. So the trolley problem is any any dilemma that where you have to choose based on how many people are involved, who's involved. Buildings being air-conditioned to the average comfort level of humans in general. Same thing. Heterosexual people are the norm, the normal majority. Minorities, everyone else. Okay? Biological minorities are simply the individuals in the world of less expressed phenotypes, whether they drew the straw from birth or from the influence of the environment. Attending to minorities becomes an exponentially expanding field by design. There are countless things that people are not normal by, all the epigenetic traits such as height, physical features, behaviors, and temperament. So basically, we're completely different in our expressions as each human being, even if you're a twin. And such, one always has to adapt to the difference of the other to some degree. When the normal society at large grants minorities some rights and are respectful and tolerant of them in various domains, they make it more allowing and liberty-filled society, or is often called a free society. So the expansion of the norm into the minority world is the opening the gates of the world of liberty, and the order laxes or relaxes. Tolerant allowance without prejudice is the first step a society can grant their minority citizens. The ability to freely exist. Albeit the allowance zone might be shrunk. In this case, majority needs to learn to tolerate minority, just like minority has to tolerate the by design dominance of the majority. So it is not the majority's fault either that they're the majority. And as such, because we societally decide, based on the trolley problem, the majority wins. Even people who believe in democracy will, by design, know that first standard deviation 68, second 95. So by the second deviation, most people are in that norm zone with some of the traits that I've pointed out. But we'll get into it more as we go. Graph 8. Perception sources and boundaries of law. The subjective and objective. How does subjective and objective play a part in our world of legislation. Basically, it puts it into the world of evidence types. We have two sources of perception, the internal and the external, the subjective and the objective, the non-observable and the observable, belief and reality. So belief versus reality is what we're talking about. And belief is anything that's subjective, really, that's inside of us, that we haven't had an external source verify in some way that that's the reality is what we're thinking, right? And then there's the perception of the actual reality. The graph is very similar to the graphs I've been showing, and as we come to find, objective will be very much closely knitted and associated with masculinity, and subjective will do such with femininity. So in this case, we have objective based on reality, subjective based on belief, and then again liberty and order. And so basically, in this quadrant, this law gives liberty justified through objective testimonies. People are granted liberty based on objective testimonies. This law gives directive justified through objective testimonies. So it gives directive based on objective. So this is the role of objective testimonies entirely, and it's adjusting both fields of liberty and order from that source. And of course, conversely here, this law gives liberty justified through subjective testimonies, and this one gives directive justified through subjective testimonies. So this is the world of subjective, balancing the liberty and order equilibrium in some way. This is the world where objectivity might not match subjectivity, and vice versa, subjectivity in this case might not match objectivity, right? Because it depends from which place we're examining the situation. And the graph, of course, is the influence on the boundaries of law from two perception sources, subjective belief and objective reality. The very liberty of the movement of entity comes from the entity within. That is, that it wants to do. The subjective is a personal and individualistic, whereas order is extremely imposed and collectivistic. So basically, liberty is the selfish element in it, whereas the one where you tell to somebody else what to do, even though it can come from selfishness, the act of what's being done is in the direction of involving others. Things in the external, that is physical world, can be verified through objectivity, whereas the true force of what is driving each entity unattainable through objectivity, right? So you can observe somebody be angry, but you will never know the subjective experience of the organism that's creating that sound or that expression, whatever it had, should it be. So we can just really observe. Liberty is the subjective driving force. It is our mind wanting to go out there and exist, whereas order is the objective force that acts upon us, even if it is societal and human-made. This puts liberty and subjectivity with the feminine, that is yin domain, and order and objectivity with the masculine or yang domain. Okay? So subjectively, we can see the world and expand into it, but only once the objective comes towards us, we can or the order comes onto us, we observe that as an objective imposition. Note the relativity. When someone is telling another to do something, their experience of themselves and what they're asking for is subjective. Whereas for the other person on the receiving end, it is completely objective. So me telling you what to do is in my mind subjective, whereas for you it's very objective and it's the same act. The objective experience is consisted of many subjectives, which we will never know. We can only know our own while physically observing and imitating any other ones. So we live in a sea of individuals who have their own individual subjective experiences, but as far as we're concerned, they will always all be objective. Whether we understand how someone feels by empathizing with it, so we can truly feel what they feel rather than understand and have a name for it, right? But even then, our feeling of sadness is our own, even if it perfectly happens to match the feeling, the actual subjective feeling on the other side. Rule by law comes from without and it acts upon. So I'm reiterating it from yet another angle, which manifests itself in the objective. Rule of law comes from within and it receives within. It is each individual one of us allowing ourselves to be ourselves, and it acts out through individual subjective experiences and feelings, even if it's ordered by one's own biological genetic makeup, which could technically label the body functions as subjective, even though those are objectively observable. So while we are feeling everything we're feeling, our body is emitting objectively as well for people to see what is happening. And this is a crucial element on catching many biological markers, for that matter, when it comes to connection between genetics and actual, let's say, emotional expression of some sort, or expression of movement of any sorts, really. In essence, whether you're female or male, if you have feelings, you have femininity and yin in you, and if you can act upon the objective world, you have masculinity and yang in you, which both males and females alike have in different doses. And then statistics then show which ones have more of which. Which basically the summary goes: liberty is subjectivity, internal experiences, femininity and yin, and order is objectivity, external motions, masculinity and yang. Now in law, when my presence, body, and existence needs to get legally defined, the definition rests in a sliding scale balance between people's collective objective observations and of each individual's subjective experiences. People can be respectful of laws, they can dismissively cut lines, or they can straight up defy law, right? So while the law holds that boundary at some point, different expressions of people will attend or respect to the boundary in also a spectrum of ways. Now, evidence type 1, the subjective or personal testimony. I want to explore the subjective a little bit right now. All claims are ultimately subjective and start as subjective. They may be triggered by a perception of something objective or not, but they're subjective nevertheless. They could be about or even directly influenced by the objective, but they're still subjective. Meaning that any idea, any thought, any sentence that I utter actually starts in the subjective. Now, we can also claim that the body itself and the emotions and certain things can actually happen before we subjectively experience them, making a claim that it's actually movement before subjectivity. Fair enough, I can grant that to some degree as an argument. My stance is that the subjectivity, even if we don't have control of it and we're just a machine to our movement, we're subjectively observing ourselves moving into the world. So as far as we're concerned, if we have especially with ideas, if we have an idea, it's starting as our subjective, and then we can express it into the world to communicate. And whether order matters or not, the last step is the expression. As far as subjectivity is concerned. So people can, even if we realize it subjectively later what we have said, the damage has already been done in the objective. So that's why I'm focusing on the objective of being the final frontier when things start empirically to happen in the world, regardless of our subjectivity. Every animal likely has some form of subjective experience, which models the real world around them. Humans additionally have imagination, which departs from modeling the objective experience entirely, right? But rather uses elements of the objective to create new ventures independent of the objective, which is technically really thinking. Imagination is in the subjective. That is why subjective ideas are not facts, and it cannot be facts. Okay? Of course, one can make a novel melody in one's head into an auditory physical manifestation of it on an instrument. It had never been an objective reality until the subjective literally created it. So a lot of times we think, is that, oh, I see a mountain, and I now can name it a mountain, right, and describe it and model it or whatever. But humans are able to create subjectively inside a model and then manifested it in the objective. So there are two different directions of how this works. The catch, humans also possess a trait called lying, unfortunately, and the law system generally doesn't like liars, that is, if not corrupt, right? Which makes setting boundaries of law pragmatically difficult. It becomes even more difficult if law system becomes corrupt itself. So not only people lie in the world, which is where the rule by law has to catch them, but rule of law is supposed to catch the government system for the same reasons of corruption up here, right? Without objective backup, one's subjective claims are simply a projection of the internal subjectivity into the outer world. So if you make any kind of a claim and you want to convince people that it's real, you have to have some objective backup for it. Unless you're okay with saying it's just my opinion. That's where opinion really comes in. Anyways, let me not digress. In essence, subjectivity is ultimately defined as what we can communicate to the world. This is inevitably always being a subjective personal testimony. And that brings us to that bridge between subjectivity and objectivity. We can go as far as saying that the subjective is only subjective to the extent of it being an objective manifestation of our nervous system, regardless of our internal, that is, subjective perceptions. Meaning that if I say I'm feeling sad, the moment I have said I'm sad, I've given you my objective proof that I'm sad, even though you have no idea how I feel. And that's what a personal testimony attests to. The same thing happens when some people saying I'm a woman. The pronunciation of it defines what it's supposed to be without you necessarily knowing that that's indeed. Now, seeking for biological markers becomes the interesting factor in making reality claims and backing them up with evidence. With this definition, whether you have an experience of anger is irrelevant. What is relevant is you're the combo of a set of empirically verifiable traits. Increased heart rate. So this is, in this case, this would be an example where you can measure it, rather than you saying, I'm excited right now, and then you have increased heart rate, or hangry, right? Flushed face, sweating, irritability, yelling, impulsiveness, etc. All of these are objectively verifiable. This is why, to me, there is a gray line between subjectivity and objectivity when it comes to internal experiences, because many of our internal experiences have some kind of a objective emoting, if you will, even if subtle, that can link itself up to that internal experience, making them technically one and the same, as I'll explore more, just in different domains, just like they're kind of the yin and yang, the brother and the sister, Subjective claims of one's internal experiences look for biological markers, right? For example, feeling sad, crying, being gay, being aroused by a person of the same sex. So if someone gets aroused, that right there is a biological marker in the emotional context of them being gay. Also, one's personal testimony can get used as the empirical evidence of the fully subjective claim, which is what I was saying about personal testimony being just because I said so. For example, he said he was sad, and we believe him because he said it. We take his word. Or more so, he swore on it. So that's even more becomes when somebody does the hand raising and does an official swearing in, which still doesn't act as a direct biological marker of the actual feeling inside. The types of biomarkers can be molecular, which is hormones, proteins, genes, right? So we can measure the amount of the hormones in someone's blood levels. Physiological, it can be blood pressure, heart rate, imaging, scans, and behavioral task performing. Some behaviors correlate so strongly with biological processes that they're treated as indirect biomarkers. There we have it, right? Which is proof by proxy, not direct proof, yet still accepted as good objective. So one's personal testimony is known and is practiced to be basically treated as a fact. If someone comes and says, I saw this and that happen, and that's their testimony, it becomes the truth. Now, evidence type 2, objective demonstrable proof. The exterior world, most everyday subjective experiences are congruent with objective experiences. I'm now drawing the point in about how closely knit they are together. Seeing a bird flying subjectively and being able to point at the bird is objective confirmation and validation. Seeing the bus and a bus actually being there to see it. This is our everyday experience. So we're constantly seeing things around us that check out to objectively exist. It'd be different if tomorrow you woke up and half of the buildings in your block were just missing. Like, I thought subjectively I saw that, but now when I go into the world, the objective, it doesn't add up. So much of the world at all times, the subjectivity and the objectivity are closely tied. Self-perception. So self-perception in the objective context means observing one's own observable biological and physiological markers. Feeling angry and noticing our hearts speed up. Measuring one's temperature with a thermometer. Being attracted to a certain sex and measuring markers of arousal. Okay. As human knowledge processing got more complex, matching the subjective to the objective became more complex as well. Meaning if I have some complicated thought that involves a mathematical function, it's going to be hard to track exactly by observing me objectively what I'm about to say. Subjective claims of the objective world look for the referenced entities in the objective. So the objective world likes objective proofs to subjective claims, pointing to a bird, for example. When there's no objective proof, first-hand witness testimonies also get considered as objective proof, even though they're fully subjective. Again, making the same point again. The interplay of sources of perception and law, graph number 8, which is these combinations that we've named already in between for this graph, okay? I'm just going to read a few more things about how it all plays out together. The physical world of the planet Earth that we live on with all its life on it is the most consistent physical evidence that we currently have that keeps being consistently objectively verifiable by everyone in real time. That is why the subjective clings to it. We all wake up the next day and our room is still there it was where it was yesterday, and the sun will rise again, and our subjectives are constantly reinforced so we don't lose our minds, I guess, to the objective. And then, of course, we depart from it with our imagination all the time as well. But it's kind of like jumping out of the water and back in, right? For a fish. The dance between subjectivity and objectivity is a constantly mutually reinforced loop. It closes the loop between reality and belief. For example, did you see it first and then believe it, or believe it first and then see it going? This is the chicken and egg. The chicken and egg is every level of emergence where two opposing forces in this way are basically just doing a dance back and forth, and neither started first. They just kind of co-evolved together to create what became. Going back and forth is replication, science. All of these movements, every time something comes back, that is a confirmation of what was on this side. So we think that happened and we see it. Oh, there it is again. Oh, now I think more that it happened. Oh, there it is again. Oh, well, that's a fact now, right? And it's a constant loop. Which one started first? Both. The answer is yes. For example, calculating that something will happen. So from there on, we can predict future now, right? In fact, much of life predicts the future all the time by planning to absorb some sunshine the next day, right? Every day we all wake up in the real world as our perceptions check out and confirm the world is still more or less the same. If we feel tired, our body emotes tiredness. If we're rested, the body is energetic, right? Society forming laws generally don't allow the subjective to roam unaccompanied by the objective in the legal world, right? We're stepping into the legal world then, for a very good reason, because our existence of society is persistently in the real world. Through the very interactions of multiple individuals, the subjective needs to match to something objective and justifiable to represent it in order for societal order to be able to hold itself, which is essentially people counting on and trusting each other. Right? So it's one thing that if you wake up the next day and you enjoy the sunrise or the sunset, but it's also a huge part of the equation for you to wake up and know that the humans around you are going to be behaving the way you subjectively have been experiencing them. Criminal and civil law, based on observation, what the person did, was their intent expressed through action, objectively and observably. Basically, the claim needs to have its objective manifestation in the real world. Law predominantly requires objective proof for any subjective claims, and more immutable the evidence, the better. Claims from the subjective or objective phenomena need to be backed by objectively observable evidence. If you make a legal claim, you have to back it up with empirical proof. And by the way, if there's just simply no proof, that's where the jury comes in, and then the subjectives of jury members becomes the objective testimony, right? Which is objective because it happened in the objective, and we as members of society accept it as objective empirical proof. This happens because it is known that subjectivity can change much easier than the objective. Stop believing in something versus burning evidence, right? I mean, these days, burning evidence is not hard because you can just erase a hard drive. But regardless, objective, especially if it's made to be sturdy and long-lasting, can be much more reliable than someone's subjective claim. And this is why it's of high order for someone who makes a promise or who makes a vow, because the vow is itself an objective testimony that what they're saying is, or even more so, will be the truth into the future. And it may become impossible to verify if individual subjective experience of the matter is invented or not, whether genuine or not. Lying. Unless, of course, the laws are managed by favoring bloodlines and thus bending the law in the direction of someone having received a bribe and lying, right? So the lying can come by the objective reality that someone wants to defend their kin and clan or whatever more than someone over there. Laws, which is back to the trolley problem. Laws like simple objective, the complex trolley problem, as it is. Laws like simple objective solutions and easily defined and tracked boundaries, while subjectivity is simply not that simple. Right? Personal testimonies, whether true or justified, are in the domain of opinions. Okay? A society where everyone ends up with the same shared opinion can make that opinion into law. So we all start with our subjective opinions about the matter, and then it can become an opinion. Oh, what does everyone think about this? Oh, we like it. Oh, we don't know. But then when we say, okay, from now on, you have to say that you like it, or we have to come across that we're saying that we like it, and then you make it sort of a rule of, or even law for that matter, that you have to like whatever the boss cooks. That's when the opinion that would be uttered otherwise subjectively becomes a law. So rather than me saying, well, I think this is happening, I would be now saying the same thing, but saying you have to be obliging to this happening. Note that there is necessarily no direct verification system that stands between personal testimonies of the subjective world and the individual subjective feelings and thoughts. Sorry, of the objective world and individuals. So basically, one's testimony is literally a step away from a lie. Like, it's impossible to verify, really. Sure, lying detector test is one of the attempts, but even then, people can fool it. Humans are very good liars. The subjective can be accepted as objective through ways of personal testimonies and oaths. The concept of swearing on a holy object is an example of bypassing the need to have proof. The proof, even without physical evidence, is thus basically merely one's account, expressing statement about it, one's personal testimony. This is where objective proof meets subjective by proxy, where it gets directly shaped by subjectivity. Objective observation adopts the subjective as objective merely for being uttered and makes it societally accepted as the truth and reality. If a number witnesses made untrue testimonies under oath and laws are made as a result, the law would be passed purely on subjectivity while being thought of being based on objectivity, right? Because they made the claim and a testimony under oath that this is truly what they saw. So it becomes part of legislation. It's something that people have to abide by while it's actually not true. And that's really where the naked emperor world comes out of this world. Both subjectively derived, unfalsifiable dogmatic ideologies and objectively derived ideologies, science-led ideologies, they all compel people to use their language and accept their beliefs, pushing order of rule by law in the direction of their overall worldview. So everything that really wants to do follow a specific direction becomes an ideology, and it can be fully backed up by science. Much of law that cannot but have to deal with strong dosages of subjective claims rely on majority of common sense people to, for example, simply express that they feel subjective fear at the time when their bodies express subjective emotion of fear, when, for example, being followed by someone at night. So when someone says, well, I'm afraid, when there's someone over there on the other side of this dark street, if you ask a whole bunch of other people, they'll all agree. So that is also used as objective testimony. Even this is where one's word becomes the biological marker itself. That's the point, ultimately. Sometimes there's objective presence of something that is subjectively unexplainable. For example, pyramids, right? On the flip side, when one is left only with subjective claims, when any objective evidence is destroyed forever, in which case personal testimonies become the next best evidence, even if not empirical. Lie detectors are an effort to get biological markers for subjective claims. The concept of a God is the ultimate subjective argument, and it has evolved in human cultural systems as the most infallible argument against enforced governance, against the tyrannical behavior. No amount of objective proof can be enough to someone invoking God that is bigger, mightier, and truer than any other claim. So basically, the concept of a God is an antidote against, sorry if I had this out of frame, the concept of a God is something that can get used, and does get used, against any level of order that wants to be brought in if someone just doesn't want it. And as such, can and does trump objectivity, because objectivity can't keep up with the human imagination. Even though ultimately objectivity and just simple movement without any potential subjectivity came first before any subjectivity evolved or emerged out of living beings. Now we're going to talk about perceiving oneself in either through the subjective or through the objective. Perceiving oneself and perceiving the exterior world, and as well as the exterior worlds. There's going to be a bunch of exploration here. Perceiving oneself, graph 9. I'll just quickly show them without getting into too much detail, and then I'll run it. Same graph is the one above. And this one's for the world of perceiving oneself, and this is going to be the domain of perceiving the world outside of ourselves. Okay? One perceives oneself through subjective experience, belief, and observing of one's own individual physical manifestation reality. Me looking at my own hand, or me feeling my hand, knowing that I'm touching my fingers right now like this, right? Without looking, I have a subjective experience. Although we can say that touching something is also objectively experiencing, so the subjectivity starts somewhere in the hand then, because we're touching the touch, right? Each skin is being touched on each side, so there's multiple domains of the objective experience, if you will. Subjective experience is manifested through personal testimonies, that's pronouncing oneself to have certain traits, regardless of there being any physical manifestation of them. For example, claiming to be connected to the ancestral spirit. At the same time, our genes, so I can say I feel like a wolf right now, or some ancestral, not wolf even, maybe like some kind of an ancestral ape, and that I identify as that personally, even though I look like a human right now, and I'm not. Mind you, the brain's in there. This is where you see the objective tracing the subjective throughout the evolution, I think. This is one of my hypotheses. At the same time, our genes are so diversely mixed up that our ancestors are literally written into our genetic code, precisely. So everything that we subjectively are experiencing is wrapped around the envelope of objectivity that we evolved through all this time. And the subjective just emerged throughout it at some point. In order to reliably classify individual legal identity of a person and their traits, or in other words, to assign a strict role of appearance and behavior, subjective testimonies can only go so far. The law also relies on any potential verifiable objective manifestations of that person's traits in the empirically observable world, which an individual can themselves do. For example, look in the mirror, measure pulse, observe behavioral patterns, etc. Right? Or for that matter, claim that you have certain traits of a different sex, for example, because the proof is in the objective, in different objective traits. Of course, the cells and the chromosomes take the cake in terms of consistency around objective proofs. Nevertheless, if that's the only argument, then an emotion wouldn't be used as a justifiable biological marker just because it's not cell-based, chromosomal, and expressing, so it's totally observed in behavior. One's identity can get derived both personally, internally, and it can also be based on societal orders externally, as well as the judgment of oneself. Meaning you can just feel at something, or you can be influenced to feel that way. And you can convince yourself by listening to somebody that you have to behave that, and then influence your subjective that way. The personal root creates unique individual expressions because it moves freely. It plays, and thus independence would be classified as a feminine trait in humans under this framework. Identity derived out of societal order will create a directed common expression, which can be classified as a masculine trait in humans, the right way to be. Okay? So that equilibrium between rule of law and rule by law, or liberty and order, is going to create a norm where everyone say, well, this is just common sense how you should be. For example, the ability to dress how one pleases versus societal zones with strict dress codes, which is most public and professional zones around us. Tracing biological markers, objective proof in gender, identity, expression, or orientation. Sex is what is objectively observable, biological. So that's fully objectively observable. Gender identity is what is subjectively experienced. Gender expression is what is objectively expressed and experienced. Okay? Because you can subjectively experience how you behave, and one can objectively observe the way one behaves or expresses oneself. Gender orientation is what is both subjectively and objectively experienced. Gender expression is by definition shaped by the subjective. Sexual expression is by definition shaped by the objective. Right? Objective, so basically the way you express something and behave, say a certain way, that is in the objective. Objective observation of oneself. Legally defining one's sexual or gender expression, a society can decide to rely on observable and reliable objective biological markers or draw definitions from one's subjective testimonies. So the law on this matter can be drawn from either side, and we've seen those examples happen on both ends. In case of, say, homosexuality, where couples would be prompted to have to play the role of a heterosexual and have a family, etc., versus where the law is accounted for subjectivity, even though, as I say, there's certain biological dose of biological markers, just arousal itself. And then in the gay world, they had, I might have the notes in here somewhere, in the gay world, they had the part of the hypothalamus, I believe, is actually a bit enlarged, and they were thinking that that could be a connection to one being gay. And supposedly there was t-shirts where people would say, the only thing big about me is the fact that my hypothalamus is large. Something like that. Currently, there's no single biological marker that can definitely confirm a person's subjective experience of being transgender. That is by definition for something where a person wants to identify as a different, gender, opposite gender in the context of an opposite sex. Having a gender identity different from the sex assigned at birth. Of course, you see the technical challenge of defining something that is subjective in comparison to something that is objective, right? So why would we even say that one saying that they're male as a gender while they're female as a sex are connected in any way, because one's subjective, one's subjective. And that brings me to the point that is that a mass amount of people's experiences in the statistical bell curve and trolley problem context will fall within the norm of one's gender birth matching one's gender expression. Using chromosomes found in every single cell of our body is an incredibly strong anchor for the creation of laws, an objective or verifiable biological marker when it comes to wanting robust ethics. Sex gets front lines with its binary nature. So if we want to know for sure that a certain person is male or female from a legal context, this is where it matters. When people say let people behave and express however they want, the issue is not whether one can be tolerant, which is kind of the topic of this entire thing, of a person who expresses like that, but rather when it becomes a legal liability, because the world of law is binary. You're right or you're wrong by societal, some standard where that boundary is drawn between rule of law and rule by law, between liberty and order. And when that is needing to be defined, then if we need to be strict about it, the fact that sex is defined in such an incredibly stable way just takes the cake. This is Peterson's point on compelled speech. Is that he refuses to be legally compelled to use speech that was predominantly based on subjectivity, that is made up. He couldn't be able to refute compelled speech itself, as we compel speech all the time, by making sure everyone uses clear and precise language when communicating. Okay? So, all the time, if I want to talk right now, if I'm talking gibberish, I will lose the audience, and if I was trying to talk to people in general, they wouldn't take me seriously. I would be considered a very confused person for societal standards, and probably need to get attended to if I did something like that. So that the compelled speech is and compelled behaviors are extremely strongly imposed. This is why Peterson's, when he says compelled speech, is not to be taken as just that bubble, but rather it needs to come with the fact that he made compelled speech when it's derived from very subjective domains is very dangerous, is essentially what his argument would have been. Peterson's assertion would go hand in hand that the society has gotten out of balance with dominant matriarchal influence, thus rendering subjectively driven memes in shapes of orders, right? So this is basically my analysis of what Peterson's point was from the framework that I'm setting up in this series, meaning that there's an actual imbalance between matriarchy and patriarchy, making each going into extremes. That's really his point. That's why he always calls out on when the left goes too far. He's wanting to explore it because they both go extremist. As one goes extreme, the other one goes extreme. And when it's a matriarchally dominant society, because subjectivity is a very feminine trait, as I just explored, it pulls it into the legislative system and allowing too much dosage of the subjectivity. This is the point, is that there has to be a dosage on both ends. Both ends are important. So you have to, even though there's no evidence, we don't want to just not believe someone, and vice versa. Conversely, a society with predominantly and out of balance patriarchal influence will compel the population to adhere to predominantly objective criteria, such as one's indisputably confirmable biological sex. So a very ordered patriarchal system will just take the, as they say, obvious, regardless of how you feel, and implement it across board on everyone. Perceiving the exterior world, graph 10, right? And this is just the rest of the world, really. Just like with perceiving oneself, one also perceives the world outside, one's body, the exterior world, through subjective experience, belief, and observing the world's physically manifestation reality, which again is our subjective experience of the world and how we objectively can point out at things that we see. Every meme and every law starts out from a subjective claim. When we make the first subjective claim, there's a house on a hill. There ought to be a physical manifestation of it to proclaim the claim objective. So basically, we have to utter it. We have to make our thought. That's to elaborate on the previous point. We have to make the subjective idea objective by exclaiming it, and thus subjective comes first. Especially when it comes to higher order thoughts in humans, which much of what we do is. Even though emotions get considered, of course, and those are much easier to spot, as already pointed out. From this very definition of everything is recursive. What is a house? The thing we call a house, and then some description. A house is what we describe the house to be, with certain amount of criteria. Same for the concept of a woman and a man. Well, what is a woman? That's why you hear the arguments such as, well, as a woman is the person who says that they're a woman. Right? That's their testimony. That's the extent of the testimony. Because we accept testimonies, they can put their hand up and they're equally say, I believe I'm a woman, right? And vice versa, right? The issue with the trans problems that are being seen in this is not whether one biologically is born to experience both. Because clearly nature's playing different permutations on our soul at all times. It's more of a question of whether the society is going to adopt the conclusion that comes predominantly from the subjective, and to which degree it would also be obliged to involve the objective as well, especially if there's nefarious forces such as people, by and large, by default, knowing and exercising their ability to deceive and lie. In which case that the minority, that is, if you do two graphs, the minority of people who would lie is probably larger than the people who genuinely have their sex and gender reversed. And just a generic example of the perceiving the exterior world is a yellow light, blinking red pedestrian light, since are objectively trackable. That's just a side note. I really quickly want to look at the combinations of what happens in legal ways when it comes to perception of oneself objectively or subjectively. This law here would give liberty to legally self-identify, justify through objective testimonies, and this one would give directive to self-identify, justify through objective testimonies. Okay. For example, on this side, liberty to legally identify to everyone as a male based on observable male physical features. This is the liberty for somebody who's born as a male to say, well, look at me, I'm male. So as a result, you have the right to identify as a male. And this one is making everybody legally have to identify as male based on observable physical features. Sorry if this is a bit small. Meaning here that because you're born like it, it's not like you can use it as your right, but that right is imposed to you by the order from outside. Okay? This on the subjective front, this law gives liberty to self-identify justify through subjective testimonies. For example, a liberty to identify to everyone as a male based on subjective experience and testimonies. So just because I say I'm male, that's the earlier subjective testimony as far as it goes world. Whereas here the law gives directive to self-identify justify through subjective testimonies. For example, making everyone have to legally identify someone as a male based on subjective experiences and testimonies. Okay, and here in very tiny I have, for example, identify determined by strong biological markers regardless how one feels about it, and here identify determined by what one feels like regardless of whether one can find strong biological markers. So this world is subjectivity based, this one's objectivity based, and they're both creating again a different bubble of order and liberty playing the eternal dance between each other. In the exterior world, this law gives liberty to perceive the world justified through objective testimonies. This one gives directive through objective testimonies. For example, having legal liberty to cross the street as many times and one wants when the light is green. So as long as the light is green, you can just be running back and forth the street. You have the legal right to do that. The law gives directive to perceive the world justified through objective testimonies, making everyone have to cross the street when the light is green, not red. Okay, so you can't cross it when it's red, right? And then in the subjective front, this is when the law gives the liberty for the world justified through subjective testimony. So this would be an example when having legal liberty to believe in the existence of an object or entity whose objectivity no one can see or verify. So you have the full legal right to believe in something that you can't prove is true. And this law gives directive to perceive the world justified through subjective testimony. So rather than having the right, one makes everyone have to believe in the evidence of an object or entity with objectivity no one can see or verify. And this is yet again that eternal dance of where you are, in this case, have the right to have subjective beliefs, and this one is when you're compelled to have a subjective belief that you don't necessarily believe in.